When I was arrested by the soldiers, I didn't think I would come back alive because they have a reputation of, killing people in detention. So I didn't think that I would come back alive. I thought I was going to die.
This is Philip Obaji Jr, a Nigerian journalist covering sub-Saharan Africa who writes for the Daily Beast. One day in December 2023, Philip went on a high-risk reporting trip to the Central African Republic to investigate the activities of Russian mercenaries known as the Wagner Group. But within an hour of arriving in a border community, he was captured, badly beaten and detained.
If I had said I was a journalist, they would have tortured me to reveal more about my identity and the works that I have done. And if you look at my author's page at the Daily Beast, you find dozens of articles directly focused on Russian atrocities in the Central African Republic. So had they seen these articles, I would be a dead man. I'll be killed.
I'm Nicola Kelly, and this is Silenced. Today, the reporter who risked it all to tell the truth about Putin's paramilitaries and their crimes in Africa. Today, the Wagner Group is known to many for the central, critical role it played in Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
We begin in eastern Ukraine, where Russia's mercenary Wagner Group claims it is in control of the fiercely contested town of Bakhmut. The head of the group unfurled a Russian flag at Bakhmut's city hall and declared this.
This is Wagner Private Military Company's flag. These are the guys who took Bakhmut.
But before this, the group operated for years in the shadows, largely unknown. In Central and West Africa, its interests primarily surround the gold mining sites of countries like Burkina Faso, Niger and Mali, exploiting the natural resources there to fund Russia's proxy wars. When Philip heard about this murky underworld, he immediately wanted to find out more.
It all started in 2018 when 3 Russian journalists traveled to the Central African Republic to investigate the activities of the Russian Wagner Group. At the time, I had barely heard about the Wagner Group. And it took until these journalists were killed in the central part of the country in a town called Sibut that I realized that Wagner was in Africa on a mission.
Philip's editor at the Daily Beast asked him to look into why these journalists had travelled to the Central African Republic and what happened in the days before they were killed.
So I began to call friends and colleagues in the Central African Republic to know what they knew about these journalists and their trip to the country. And that was how I picked up interest in the Wagner Group, and I began to investigate what they were doing across Africa.
And what were your first impressions as you started digging for that information? Were you surprised by the scale of their influence, or like how far-reaching their activities were?
Oh yes, it was shocking to begin with. I didn't even know at the time that the Russians had embedded themselves into governance in the country, that a national security advisor to the president was a Russian. I didn't even know all this. I didn't know that, Russian paramilitaries were the ones dishing out orders to Central African Republic forces. So it was shocking the level at which the Russians had so much of influence and even impact in the country. Yes.
Did you get a sense of what their interest was in the parts of Africa that you began to investigate, so Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger? Was it predominantly about natural resources, like the gold mines? Were they starting to exploit some of those natural resources at the time?
Well, at the time I heard about them in 2018, it wasn't clear as to what they intended to do. But when I began to read in the newspapers, on the internet, I saw in some reports that the Wagner Group was interested in the gold and diamond mines in the Central African Republic. And that was troubling. I knew that if they had their way, there would be so much of chaos, conflicts, and even killings because the gold and diamond mines, that were scattered across the country in the Central African Republic were in the hands of the rebels and militia groups. So I knew it was never going to be easy for the Russians to just go into these places where the mines are located and then take over the mines. So I saw trouble looming here for many locals in the country.
What tends to happen when the Wagner Group associates enter these territories? Because, I mean, they're known for using very violent methods, aren't they? And there are also paramilitary groups that sort of jealously guard these mines. Like, does it automatically result in conflict and deaths around the mines?
Oftentimes, that has been the case. I'll give you a couple of examples. In a town called Aigbado in the central part of the country, a similar situation happened in the sense that the Russians went to Aigbado to take control of this mine, the gold mine in Aigbado. But as it is with virtually every mine in the country, armed militiamen are in control, or were in control of the Aigbado gold mine. And it was never going to be easy for the Russians to seize this mine. So they got into Aigbado and began to open fire at people who lived very close to the gold mine. And then eventually over 70 people were killed, in this incident. It's happened over 2 years ago. And in another town called Koki, I went to Koki last December, a similar thing occurred. The Russians went to Koki and they were interested in taking over the gold mine. And once they got into Koki, they began to open fire, and then the people who were in the vicinity when the Russians arrived were killed by the bullets. So each time the Russians want to seize a gold mine, we end up seeing a massacre.
It must be terrifying for the civilians that live in the vicinity of the gold mines.
Of course. And that is why a lot of people on their own have started to flee mining areas, because it looks like at some point the Russians will get there and do exactly what they've done in the past in places like Yanga, in places like Aigbado, in places like Koki. So people in mining communities are very scared, and many have begun, to flee these areas because they don't want the situation where the Russians will just show up and begin to open fire. Yeah.
So Philip knew the dangers he faced going into these mining communities. He'd heard from 2 contacts embedded within the Wagner Group that he was already on a list of journalists the Russians wanted to monitor, the cross already on his back. He knew he couldn't travel by plane to the Central African Republic. He would need to travel by land to a mining village just over the border from Cameroon. Late last year, he set off on his journey.
So after crossing the border into Beloko, I stayed in a small guest house. And then the following day in the morning, I got a commercial motorcyclist to take me to the border. I was hoping to interview people who were fleeing conflict into Cameroon, some of whom were artisanal miners whose communities had been taken over by the Russians.
Within moments of starting to speak to people in the border town, a pickup vehicle raced towards him.
About 4 Central African soldiers came down from the vehicle, and then they held me on my trouser, around my waist, and began to drag me. And then I started to scream for help. I was screaming, "Who are you? Leave me alone, let me go." And they kept pulling me, and they were speaking in a language I didn't understand, both in French and in the local language. So I kept screaming, and they wouldn't let me.
Among the group were 2 Russians who told their local associates to take Philip away, that they suspected him of being a terrorist.
They dragged me on the floor and then took me to a small military post. They had a military post not far away from the border. And there was a container in that post, a shipping container, so to speak. And then they threw me into the container and then locked me in the container. There was no electricity. There was just a very small window, and it was so hot. There were rats all in the container. And before they even threw me into the container, they were beating me with their guns, and their whips, slapping me, trying to have me make a confession as to who I was. I kept telling them that I was just going to speak to people. I didn't mention that I was a journalist, but they said I was a spy. I was a foreign spy, and I said I wasn't. That I was only just there speaking to people to ask questions.
The next day, after a night spent in the rat-infested shipping container, the motorcyclist who took Philip to the border managed to intervene to get him released.
He came with a senior military officer from the Central African Republic. It was this senior officer who pleaded for my release, and then that was how I got out of detention. But they didn't hand me back my camera and my phone, so I lost both my camera and my phone, during the journey. So that was what happened. So I had bruises on my legs, hands, on my eye. I was badly injured.
But despite having narrowly escaped death, Philip was determined to finish the investigation he'd started.
So I went back to Cameroon, to the border community, Garo Bulai, which is on the border with the Central African Republic. So I went there, got treated, and then I bought a new phone and a new camera, and then went back to the Central African Republic.
Why? Why did you go back?
Nicola, I have traveled so far. I have traveled for 2 days to get to the border. So I didn't want to go back empty handed because it was a very dangerous journey. And I traveled through areas that were already in conflict, areas in Cameroon. So I crossed back into the Central African Republic, and then I went straight to communities near Koki to do my investigation. So I didn't want to come back empty handed.
It sounds like you were lucky to escape alive. I mean, did you ever question whether you would continue to investigate the Wagner Group or the atrocities that you witnessed?
It was dangerous, and I understand. And I don't think I'm going back to the Central African Republic when we have the current regime in power, because it was a very, very difficult and very dangerous mission.
Part of the reason why Philip wanted to go back into the Central African Republic is because so little was known about the atrocities taking place in villages surrounding the mining sites. His sense was that if he didn't do it, the stories of lives lost, of horrific human rights abuses, would never get out there.
Until this day, I haven't seen any other report about the Koki massacre other than mine. So if I didn't go into Koki, no one would have known exactly, what happened there. That dozens of people were killed by the Russians. I would have been frustrated if I had returned to Nigeria with nothing. So I said to myself, look, you've come too far. Don't just go empty-handed. Get something at least. And I'm happy I went back, after the whole incident, because I eventually produced 2 very powerful stories. One on the Koki massacre and the other one on the rape of women and girls at a military base in Boa in the northwestern part of the country. So I'm so glad I went back at the time I did, yeah. I'm not sure I want to go back anytime soon, but I'm glad I went back at the time, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, those sound like really challenging stories to expose, even without the level of personal security risk that you faced. Can you tell us a bit about those atrocities? I know you did some work around the rape of women who'd just given birth and the murder of children at a mosque, for example. They're pretty harrowing stories, aren't they? What were the challenges for you?
Well, for this one, because I had to go into, the places where these atrocities took place. After I returned back to the Central African Republic following my arrest and torture, I was heading straight to Koki because before I even traveled to the country, some of my contacts had told me on the phone that a massacre had taken place. So I began to interview as many people as possible and put together those who witnessed the incident. I was able to speak to about 16 of them, and then they narrated to me exactly what happened, how the Russians just showed up, one particular day in October and began to open fire. Someone had told me that the Russians had visited the community a month before and then warned people to leave the community because there's a claim that the company had taken over the gold mine, and the government wanted the people who lived near the gold mine to vacate the area. But there was no evidence at all that anyone had bought this mine. And after a month, the Russians just showed up in Koki and began to open fire at people in an attempt to take control of the mine.
After that, Philip travelled to another village, the village of Bois, to investigate crimes against women and young girls.
So I spoke to over a dozen victims, of this atrocity, and they all said the same thing, that they were taken to the Bois military base by Russian paramilitaries, where they were drugged, raped, and then administered contraceptive pills and shots. So it was a very harrowing experience and very painful story to listen to, because victims as young as 13 were abused by the Russians.
As he began to delve more into the Wagner Group's foothold in countries like the Central African Republic, Philip began to understand how the Russians had managed to gain so much influence across the country.
In the Central African Republic, you have to go back to the problems that the country had faced recently. In 2013, the country descended into a civil war when Christian militias and Muslim rebels fought each other to take control of power. And because of this war, the UN imposed an arms embargo on the country.
Nobody was able to buy arms, and the government couldn't bring them into the country. The president, Faustin Archange Touadera, realised that if he was to stay in power, he would need to ask the UN Security Council to lift the arms embargo, but no member was willing to help. He would need to ask Russia for their assistance.
So he went to Russia and got Russia to do two things. One, get the UN Security Council to lift the arms embargo, and two, to get Russian military instructors in the country to train the Central African military to be able to tackle these rebels and militia groups. So the Russians agreed to get the arms embargo lifted and also to send instructors to the country. But there was just one condition they gave to the Central African government. They are going to be able to explore the country's gold and diamond resources. And when they showed up in the country in late 2017, they began to not just train local soldiers, they also began to look into ways at which they could explore the gold and diamond resources, and that's what they've been doing since then. In areas where you have gold mining activities taking place, there's been lots of human rights atrocities, massacres, and what have you that we witnessed. So the Russians are able to do what they do with impunity because the government has given them every support and every backing they need to continue. The government is desperate to stay in the power, and Russian paramilitaries are helping them achieve that.
And then do they take some of that money from the mining operations for themselves?
Oh yes. And the millions of dollars that is accrued from mining bypasses the states. And you see the Russians will mine gold and then sell this gold in the Middle East and in other places in Africa. So that's millions of dollars that's bypassing the state. So yes.
You said a moment ago that part of the motivation or part of the reason why you wanted to go back into the Central African Republic is because if you didn't go, then nobody else would be investigating these horrific human rights abuses that you're talking about now. Do you think that the world knows enough about Russia's influence in the Sahel, and how do you get these stories out there? How do you make the world, but the international community, how do you make them aware of what's going on in the Sahel?
Well, to an extent, I think more people needs to know what's going on. Not many people know what's happening, but I think that the media in the West know enough to be able to talk more about what's going on, and that's where sometimes I frown, because I don't think that the Western media has focused a lot and enough on what's going on in Western Central Africa. Last week, I traveled to Washington, D.C., where I testified, in a congressional hearing on Russian imperialism. And I spoke about my experience in the Central African Republic, and also spoke about what the Russians were doing in the country. I also spoke about, Russian activities and influence in West Africa, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Niger, and everywhere else, across the West African region. I was able to meet with the staff of some senators and members of the House of Reps in the United States. So I had many meetings at the Hill with congressional staff. I had meetings at the State Department. And the aim of all these meetings was to keep them abreast, make them understand what's going on in West and Central Africa as far as Russian influence is concerned, and then seek ways at which they can help in terms of, training local journalists as to how to counter Russian disinformation and supporting the media to report what is right. In the course of doing so, I realized that many people did not even know. Many of these congressional staff and government officials did not know so much about what the Russians were doing here. And I needed to let them know and to let them intervene on this. And as long as no one does anything about this, and as long as we don't talk much about this, the Russians will continue to have a field day, continue to do what they're doing with impunity. So yes, to answer your question, there's not so much focus on Russian operations, and that has got to change.
Last August, the former leader of the Wagner Group, Evgeny Prigozhin, died in suspicious circumstances when the plane he was travelling in crashed. But the paramilitaries obviously remain a very dominant presence in a number of African countries, with or without Prigozhin at the helm. Where do you think the story is going to go from here?
Well, right now, because most of these countries where they are countries that are desperate, and there's military dictatorship in these countries. In Burkina Faso, Niger, and in Mali, where the Russians are, you have military governments in place. There are military juntas in these countries. So it's very difficult to actually do anything about these countries. But my concern is that we shouldn't see a situation where the Russians continue to expand to other countries, and which is what they're trying to achieve, because they're spreading lots of disinformation in countries where there's stable democracy. In other French-speaking countries, in Togo, for example, in Ivory Coast, if you travel there, you will find out that a section of the media is being paid to publish disinformation that is pro-Russia and anti-West, and also disinformation that is capable of undermining democracies in this region. So what I have been calling on governments, across board from everywhere in the West to do in terms of helping Africans with is the fact that let's make sure that Russian activities does not extend, to a place where other democracies will be threatened. It's very difficult to deal with what they're doing in countries like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso because the military is there. But let's ensure that they don't expand beyond these countries. Yeah.
You've been listening to Silenced. I'm Nicola Kelly. The producer was Kevin Caners. This is a podcast series for Article 19.